Welcome to Connections with BCD Travel, an ongoing conversation about the modern-day travel program, the impact of technology, and how travel buyers can take control and drive change. What are we waiting for? Let's start connecting.
Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. I'm Miriam Moskovich.
And I'm Chad Lemon. We love hearing from you all. And we've made it easy for you to connect with us. If you're listening on a major podcast platform like Apple or Spotify, click into this episode and then click on the text us link. You can also head to bctravel.com/podcast and send us a note there.
Chad, when was the last time you traveled out of our home country?
A few weeks ago, I went to BCD's big global sales and marketing meeting in Spain. How about you?
My last trip was to Japan with my niece.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Well, I ask you this because have you ever given any thought to how complicated it is to move around the earth, move around the world, crossing through different countries with visas and visa-free travel?
Absolutely, yeah. And especially in the corporate travel world, not just one person, right? It's thousands of people across hundreds of countries daily. So I'm always pumped when I arrive at an international destination and I see the e-gates for a really quick experience.
Same, but that's not how it always is. There's often places you go, right? Depending on where you live and what kind of passport you have, how complex it might be to go where you're going. And if you're a travel manager and you're managing this for hundreds or thousands of travelers moving around the earth at any given time, you've got a lot to think about. You have a lot to help them with, and there's a lot of outcomes, right, that you got to control for. So we've got a great guest today to join us. We're going to be speaking with G3 Global Services. They're a BCD Travel marketplace partner. Charlie Cobb is G3's COO, and I'm looking forward to hearing his expert insights and advice.
Welcome to the podcast, Charlie. Let's start with a maybe not so obvious question. We use the term visa and passport services in the BCD marketplace. But when we talk about visas as they relate to business travel, we could be talking about visa-free travel, visa on arrival, pre-trip, visa approvals. Can you just tell us briefly the differences between all of them?
Sure. And thanks for inviting me to the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking to your audience. But we in our industry essentially break the visa business down into four categories. The first one would be a visa free, which is pretty simple. It means you can just show up. The strength of your passport allows you to gain access to that country with just your passport. And that's done through geopolitical agreements that allow for free travel between these countries. The next one is visa on arrival. This is not as optimum as it used to be. I mean, people aren't really using this visa on arrival, but essentially is just that. You show up and you pay a visa when you show up to the gate, and then they gain access to the country that way. The third one is a little bit more complex, and that is what we would call a pre-trip visa or a consular visa. And that one requires a little bit more data collection, biometric collection, a little bit more about who the traveler is. The relationship between your passport and the host country may not be so great. So they definitely want to know a little bit about you and who you are. And some of it may require a letter from your employer as to the reason why you're traveling. And those typically require a trip to the consulate or embassy, which is where we typically come in. And then there's this new phenomenon in the last decade, which is the electronic travel authorization or the e-visa.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Essentially, it's pretty simple. It's an automated tool that allows you to access the country. Before you get on the plane, you go onto a website and you pay a fee, file a form, and give some information, and then the country can collect information about you. But it's all done electronically, and the results of the visas given to you back electronically. So those are the four that we break our travel visas down into these days.
So, and how does G3 play a role in the business travel world and the visas world?
Well, so think of travel documents as toll gates to your trip.
Okay.
And I'm sure there's plenty of CFOs and VPs of finance out there listening to the podcast and wondering, oh my gosh, like I have to pay for all of this.
Yeah, what's this going to cost me? Yep.
Yeah. I mean, and what we always tell people is your journey is a long journey, and you're going on that journey for a reason. You're going for a business trip. You're going to close a business deal. Well, you're not going on that trip unless you have the proper travel documentation. And so we view it as a toll gate. So we're a pretty small line item on the travel budget from a finance perspective. The travel itself is the bigger piece, but you're not going on that trip, and you could be missing that opportunity if you don't secure the right documents at the right time. And so we take the guesswork out of the application process for you. Our travel consultants are experts. We have country-specific experts that know the rules and requirements at every single country. And based on your itinerary information and where you're going, we have the ability to preemptively go out and contact the traveler and say, hey, we just saw you booked a trip to China. Then you need a visa. Let's help you get there. Because there's a huge opportunity to save trips that could potentially be lost. And you can't replace 30 years of building relationships at consulates and embassies, and that's what we have. So if we run into any issues, our organization is able to keep your travelers up to date, keep your travel managers up to date, keep everybody in compliance, and to the extent you have an issue, we're able to expedite and or resolve those issues at the consulate and embassy level for your travelers. We want our travelers to be good at their job. We want to make sure we're good at helping you get where you need to be so you can perform your job.
You just mentioned 30 years of relationships with consulates. Tell us how G3 began.
So G3 actually started in Miami, Florida, in the U.S. in 1993, 94. And it was started by a couple of businessmen who had some challenges getting travel visas to go conduct business overseas, and realized there was an underserved opportunity, a market that was not being served, so an underserved opportunity. And they started obtaining visas and making relationships with consulates and embassies. And then, that branched out into several of the larger companies in Miami, Florida, and their executive teams and their flight crews and their flight operations teams, because we know pilots and crew need passports and travel visas to be able to operate the aircraft internationally. And that grew into the aviation space. And since then, we've been growing like crazy. And it essentially started because a couple of guys couldn't get into a country they needed to get to for a work meeting.
So, you just gave us that example. And, you've said that the visa and immigration policies are constantly changing around the world. And so for our listeners, many of them are travel managers. This is very, very difficult to manage. And it's a source of stress that I have to say, I'm hearing from the field right now that it is becoming a larger question for many folks managing large global travel programs, or even not large global travel programs. So can you talk a little bit about how travel managers can stay on top of all this stuff?
Well, it's obviously a full-time job, and it's so much of a full-time job that we have an entire company that does nothing but spend their time in doing that.
Exactly. Solid answer right there. Solid.
And so if you look at a matrix of all the countries and all the passport types there's just over 190 countries out there. So that means that there's 190 countries that have requirements for another 189 countries. And so there's over 35,000 different variations of rules that you have to apply. Now they're bucketed into some of the basic e-visa, consular visa points that we talked about earlier. But these rules are always changing. And I think if anyone can agree, the geopolitical environment, what's going on in the world today is going to continue to cause these requirements to change. And as countries pick at each other and as they develop good relationships, their free travel will either be restricted or open back up. And so it really is important for everyone to know that you have to be aware of the requirements. Otherwise you won't gain entry. And a lot of times for travel managers, they're managing large relationships with the traveler providers and the people who own all this inventory. And they've got travelers out there that are booking all these trips and not necessarily knowing that they need a visa, right? And so our proactiveness in our relationship with BCD allows us access to the itinerary information to ensure that we are flagged when people book a trip that requires a visa on arrival or a consular visa.
Okay, I want to ask you close to the same question, but kind of in reverse. What happens when a travel program doesn't have a visa plan in place? What happens if they don't engage a company like G3?
Well, I mean, obviously a lot can happen, and I'm not sure that a lot of it's good. We just spent some time addressing our CFO audience out there, but first there's the lost opportunity and the lost money of booking a trip, having to change the trip, and then maybe not even being able to attend the meeting because they don't have their travel documents in place. And I think worse, I mean, travelers can be detained at the border. If they're able to get on the flight, and if they're able to get right, you could show up and then be denied entry to the country, which is somewhat embarrassing for the employee. And I think employers want to make sure that their employees are safe when they travel and can get into the countries they need to get to. And that's our role and responsibility to help the travel manager look good in those situations, because it never is going to look good to have an employee detained at the border.
You know, there have been some major changes recently regarding visas and how countries are approaching international travel. Charlie, can you speak to just some of the most noteworthy ones that come to top of mind for you?
Sure. Yeah, some of the bigger ones that are noteworthy recent is the United Kingdom. Obviously, the United Kingdom is cracking down a little bit and requiring visa upon or visa electronic visa. Brazil is also another one that is especially in the United States and other countries from Europe are adding visa required and e-visa required. And then the Schengen nations, the Schengen Nation Agreement is also now requiring an electronic entry fee for any of those countries. So there's a little bit of monetization going on for some of that for economic development reasons, but they're also wanting to collect more information about travelers entering their countries. So those are some pretty big recent events that are occurring this year.
Very big changes. How do you see travel programs working through the messaging of all of this and how it relates to requirements in travel? What sort of messaging do you see working for either the manager, the program, or even the travelers themselves?
We really like itinerary data. The messaging upon noticing that you booked a trip is ultimately a good thing. However, if your trip is next week, you may be a little bit challenged in that. So really understanding sort of the key countries where you're going to be traveling, and making sure that all of your travelers understand that there's a little bit more work that needs to be done than just getting on the plane is, I think, really important. Obviously, email communication, blasting, alerts on your travel management website are really, really good. We have a program which we call a managed service program. So if you have a handful of people that are going to be going to China and they need to be able to enter China, India, Brazil, and the UK at any given point in time, we will actually make sure that your documents don't expire until you tell us you're no longer on that program. And so that's another way for us to make sure that for especially some of those road warrior travelers and some of those executives that need a handful of countries they have to be able to go to at all times, we certainly support, because we just make sure you have valid documents at all times.
Okay, Charlie, last question for you. What's the one thing you want our listeners, travel managers, to know about visas, visa-free, and e-visa travel, about what's happening in the world today?
So I think we can all agree that geopolitical changes and certain unrest in the world is always going to be a fluid situation, and it's going to affect your documents. So just because you are able to enter a country today without a visa, not necessarily the case tomorrow. So for all of your travelers and your travel managers, for the travelers, you should just be aware of where you're going and research those requirements. If you're with a partner like BCD and G3 and you book a trip, know that we're gonna be able to support you in that effort. For all travel managers are already cut pretty thin. Looking at the usage of a firm that can help you with this is a really good idea. It's going to make you look good, and it's going to protect all the travelers at your company. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure people can get where they want to go, and the travel managers have a lower risk of responsibility around making sure that everyone can get where they have to go.
Have you ever had issues crossing an international border, Chad?
Yes. The very first time I traveled internationally for work, I was detained at the UK border for like 5 or 6 hours. It was traumatic, but thankfully I learned my lesson and I know what to do now. So it's all behind me.
Well, thanks for connecting with us, everyone. Do you have a visa horror story or a unique international travel experience? Send us a message and tell us about it. Until next time.
Thanks for connecting with us. BCD Travel helps companies travel smart and achieve more. We drive program adoption, cost savings, and talent retention through digital experiences that simplify business travel. Learn more about the topics you heard on this episode by visiting bcdtravel.com/podcast.